Hello and welcome to today's lecture, which is the last in the Women and Gender Performance in the Phoenician Homeland and Diaspora series. The series is co-sponsored by the Bade Museum of Biblical Archaeology, the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley, and East Carolina University. My name is Brooke Norton. I'm the Associate Curator at the Bade Museum, and before we get started today, I would like to begin by reading a brief statement on behalf of the Bade Museum. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huchiyon, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders and their ancestors. We are living in a moment that warrants deep reflection on our past and present. As a museum dedicated to advancing knowledge of the archaeology and history of the ancient Levant, the Bade Museum welcomes scholarly discussions across boundaries of nationality, religion, and gender identity. In many global contexts, equal access to healthcare, education, fair wages, and human rights is contested on the basis of sex, gender, and other identity categories. In an effort to bring light to these timely issues, to serve a broader public audience online, and to connect to the local community that it serves, the museum is taking action to become a more inclusive, welcoming, and equitable institution that practices the philosophy of radical inclusion adopted by its parent institution, Pacific School of Religion. One of these steps is the continued creation of public programming. Through this lecture series, we hope to highlight new and established scholars who are engaging with risky and marginalized topics concerning women, gender performance, and sexuality in the past. We invite you to participate in these programs so that together we can listen, learn, and work towards creating a more inclusive museum community. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to now invite my colleague, Jess Johnson, to the floor to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Brooke. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Oggiano. Dr. Oggiano is Director of Research at the Institute of Heritage Sciences at the National Research Council of Italy. She is trained as an archaeologist, specialized in the first millennium BC Southern Levant and in Phoenician and Punic Sardinia. She has participated in or directed excavations in Sardinia, Syria, and Tunisia. She has also taught Near Eastern archaeology and Phoenician Punic archaeology at several Italian universities, from Pisa to Florence to Naples, and she is now Professor of Geography and Archaeology of Ancient Near East at the Pontificio Istituto Biblico, the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. Her areas of interest range from material culture studies to trade and, above all, the so-called archaeology of cult and material religion. She is co-director with Wissam Khalil of the Kharayeb Archaeological Project, Phoenician Cult Place at Kharayeb, the rural site of Jemjim, and the port of Tel Kazmieh, Lebanon. Finally, she currently serves as editor-in-chief of Rivista di Studio Fenici, the Journal of Phoenician Studies. Dr. Oggiano, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I can share my presentation. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you see everybody's okay?
Yes, we can see it. It looks good.
Okay, perfect. First of all, I would like to thank my colleague and friend, especially Aaron, who invited me to speak in this interesting lecture series. Since this is the last lecture, I thought it would be useful to begin with a general reflection on the topic on gender and the material religion, which we will divide into two parts. The first will deal with some theoretical issues. The second will present some examples of ritual actions practiced by women in the Levant in the first millennium, using both historical and anthropological approaches. Oh, sorry, next one. I cannot. Okay. In the title, I speak of Phoenician women, but in fact, I will speak of the whole Levant, a region that, although large and diverse in terms of geographical feature and type of resources, presents common cultural matrices. I'm thinking of the sharing, for example, of certain structural religious aspects, at least until the Persian age. I would also add to the title, using the archaeological records as only sources, to make it clear what the possibility and the limitation of this kind of analysis are. The term purposes, actions, and the ritual are elements for first methodological consideration. In general, the practical functional action of human daily life are dictated by the achievement of a purpose. This type of action has the characteristic of leaving more or less obvious traces in the archaeological record and can therefore be adequately documented by archaeologists. The terminology used by the archaeologists when reconstructing the sequence of action refers precisely to the semantic horizon indicated by the use of such terms as action, activity, and activity group. In the transition from documenting the activity to interpreting it, the focus shifts to identify the purpose for which the action was performed. The traces left by some human action are easy to interpret. A trench at the base of some masonry and parallel to it can easily be read as the foundation trench of a masonry structure, and the purpose of the action that produced it can easily be identified as the desire to build a wall. When we try to reconstruct through layers and objects the purposes of action relating to the sphere of human thought, that is, when one wants to investigate what they thought, what they believe, the examination of archaeological data becomes more complicated. I'm not referring only to religious thought, but to abstract thought in general, which is not necessarily related to an action. For example, the elaboration of a story or myth that was not expressed in the realization of images of given actions, for instance, the act of burying a dog, like here in Ashkelon, the example I put, but also philosophical thought and so on. This is the sphere of so-called cognitive archaeology. But let me very briefly sum up the study on the subject. Let's start with the influential Christopher Oakes ladder of inference, which, although dated, can still be useful as a starting point for our reasoning. Christopher Oakes noted that for archaeological data alone, it was relatively easy to reconstruct a production technique, fairly easy to reconstruct subsistence economies, and considerably harder to reconstruct economic institutions. Inferring from archaeological data, religious institution and spiritual life would instead be the hardest inference for all. Building on this quote, the great Colin Renfrew, in his seminal study of the archaeology of cult, stated that the archaeology has not direct access to the cult practices of early times. Its knowledge of them must come by a process of inference from the study of material remains. According to the scholar, a distinction must be made between belief and cult. Belief, a concept that refers to the existence of some transcendent or supernatural force of power, and the cult, a word that defines a religious rather than secular ritual. Distinction between faith and the practice. He argues that archaeologists working on artifacts cannot observe anything but rituals, or better still, the outcome of actions that can plausibly be seen to derive from religious belief. Other scholars, and I quote just Flannery, have not strayed from this line of thought, emphasizing the difference between theology and ideology, worship and the ritual. Against this kind of approach, which tend to distinguish cult from belief, the practical from the cognitive, there are those who argue instead that this distinction did not exist in antiquity. Mireia Bertin, for example, in the introduction to the Proceedings of the Congress of Archaeology and Religion published in 2001, considered that religion was an aspect fully embedded in the economic life, social and political structure of the community. In other words, they highlight the artificiality of the distinction between cultic and religious conceptualization. As far as the traditional study of the Levant is concerned, the topic of the difference between belief and cult is particularly evident in different positions on the role of images and their interpretation. William Dever said, to construct a religion on the basis of its stand to remain, belief through text, cult through material culture. On the other way, Ottmar Kehl and Christopher Uhlinger said religious concepts are expressed not only in text, but can be given a pictorial form on items found in the material culture as well. Since the 2000, the sharp division between belief and the cult has become less central to the debate. While archaeologists have always had to consider aspects of materiality, we have only materiality when attempting to reconstruct the religious aspect of ancient society, no choice. Anthropologists and historians of religion have more recently turned to the materiality of religion. Material culture is no longer considered a simple passive reflection of cultural value, thoughts and cosmological beliefs that are understood to prefigure them. And the greater consideration might be given by archaeologists to efficacy and agency concepts now we know largely used by archaeology and interpretation. This is not the place to dwell on definition of religion and a ritual, but as Catherine Bell offers her thoughts on definition and their usefulness, particularly for the term ritual, arguing that it is less important to define what the ritual is than to delineate what ritual does. We move another time from concept to action. Indeed, we must remember that fundamental problem with both religion and ritual, and in general, I can say, is that as categories, they are the result of the modernist Western mentality. It is this thinking that has produced the additional dichotomies between secular and the religious, and the ritual versus practical. It is often repeated that archaeologists in particular have used the concept of ritual whenever they have faced difficulty in finding a practical or economic explanation for an observed pattern. In practical, when we cannot understand what is, often we say probably is ritual or religious. However, there have been some interesting recent developments in this debate. Some anthropologists of religious, for example, emphasize the need to view religious not as belief system, but as material and sensory practices. The launch of Material Religion journal goes to the same direction. Every religious activity is described as a world of practices that unfold within a material environment. Scholars now agree that ritual action plays a fundamental role in the reconstruction of ancient religion. There is no longer only thinking religion, but also doing religion, a term used by Cohen and Motis. In this sense, the title of John Child's famous text remains remarkably effective, in my opinion. Qu'en faire, c'est croire. Très efficace. La traduzione, when doing is believing the sacrificial rite of a Roman. And now, moving to the second part of my conference, start with this quotation of Sarah Millage Nelson. Since gender itself is often difficult to approach with archaeological data, and religion is likewise difficult, the combination of gender and religion seems like skating on the very thin ice. That's why I do this premise. We are on a very thin ice. Archaeological manifestation of material culture, which could be interpreted as indicating both gender and religion, are uncommon. Solid evidence of gender mostly comes from depiction of gender person and sexable burial. Indeed, women represent a sector of society that is often overlooked in the ancient textual tradition of this area. Just think of biblical texts written by men and for men, with archaeology often being the only source to refer to. Women's world was one in which the religious and the non-religious were part of a single unfolding of actions, punctuated by ritual that accompanied women's life from birth to death. Called mother, guardian, and supplicant, women were the custodian of everyday and personal objects of family memory, of the memory of things. An important role in this regard was played by the elderly women, who were the link between generations. Through this gesture, often silent and accompanied by ritual, thinking, for example, of bread making, women played a major role in the construction of group cultural identity. With this regard, I'm from Sardinia, and I like very much the novel of the Nobel Prize, Grazia Deledda. In her short story, Il Pane, she said that in Sardinia, bread making was a domestic tradition, and that domestic tradition were, in our house, religion and the law. And it's a very significant. Woman performance of daily action, often repeated and changed over time with a similar object and gesture from one generation to the next, may have a function as an unconscious form of cultural resistance to change that were occurring for various reasons outside the home. The study of household objects, though, becomes crucial because it provides important clues when compared with other types of documentation related to public and owned cultic contexts in the community. The home was, in fact, the place where memory of family past was enshrined and honored through the performance of ritual that included, precisely, the use of terracotta figurines, along with supports from burning of aromatic substances and amulets. The rooms for such practice, the so-called cult corner, cult rooms, were not architecturally conspicuous, and the artifacts used were little different of those used in daily life. Once they were no longer used, this object became part of the domestic memory, to the extent that they were buried inside the house, like in this case, Telfara Shrine. And now we move to the iconographies that are the only direct sources we have of the ritual action, of the action of women in general. The elements that allow us to approach the question of religion in archaeology are often limited. Artistic expression, sculpture, painting, engravings. The studies of images can therefore be considered the main, if not the only, direct source for identifying women's participation in ritual, religion, or otherwise. I will now present a few examples of how we can move from the examination of iconographic sources to the interpretation, which, using historical ethnographical comparativism, can help us to imagine women's intention in their best known activities, traditionally summarized in the phrase "from cradle to grave." When using the comparative method, historical, anthropological, archaeological, and iconographic, to deal with themes that are defined as universal, such as motherhood, birth, and death, as this can be inferred from images used to represent them, we must bear in mind some of the dangers inherent in such a method. So we can use it, but be aware. Indeed, in the field of archaeology, for example, ethnographical comparison is certainly stimulating because it can open up a new interpretative perspective. but it can also be misleading if used indiscriminately. Indeed, the risk is at best to create an abhorrent trivialization of interpretation of artifact and action of event, at worst to interpret the past in the light of the present, though stretching the evidence from the data collected. So after this premise, let us proceed to examine how frequently certain central experiences in women's life were represented: pregnancy, childbirth, motherhood, participation in rites of detachment from the deceased, and, not to be forgotten, the equally vivid experience of seduction and sexuality. The prenatal phase and the concern related to the delicate moment when the woman is the bearer of new life are rare, but find a good illustration in the iconography of a group of terracotta figurines attested as early as 8th century, but widespread especially between 6th and 1st century BC. It is an image of a pregnant woman sitting or standing, often with a hand on her belly. This type of iconography is widespread through Phoenicia, the Palestinian coastal regions, and Cyprus. This iconographic type lost lasting popularity and find the best example, using comparative approach, in La Madonna del Parto di Piero della Francesca. Its appearance can be considered a real novelty, coming back to Phoenicia, given that the representation on female fertility was generally associated with images of naked women with their hand on their breast. The representation of the pregnant woman would reflect the formalization, materialization of the ritual practice of invoking good offspring, a good pregnancy, a good childbirth in cultic ceremonies, where such images came to play a central role. The moment of birth, whose positive and poetic aspects are generally highlighted today, was experienced in ancient societies at a time of great suffering and danger for both mother and child. Childbirth was the main cause of female mortality, and though made the woman a liminal person on the borderline between life and death. Depictions of women giving birth are very rare in the ancient world. For the Levantine area, a terracotta group from Cyprus offers a particularly vivid depiction of a woman in childbirth resting on the leg of the midwife, with whose help she is able to push the baby's head out between her legs. It's really impressive. While depictions of childbirth are rare, those of breastfeeding are among the most widespread in all geographical and chronological contexts. Each can be described as a universal iconographic theme, perhaps the most widely used to evoke the theme of motherhood in all the periods, from prehistory to the present day. The comparison between the rarity of depiction of a childbirth and the frequency of those of breastfeeding can be taken as an indication of the different attitude that communities had towards the two activities. Childbirth was often considered impure because of a characteristic of the event related to the strong pain accompanied by screaming, the liminality of the mother's role between life and death, between her and the unborn child, the great presence of blood, and so on. Breastfeeding, on the other hand, was considered undoubtedly vital, related to nourishment, far from danger, a clear image of an indissoluble bond between mother and child, between motherhood and life. Now we try, considering this strong bond between mother and children, we can try to find the women through the images of the children. The first years of the child's life, in which the mother's role is fundamental, see the child as the protagonist of ritual designed to integrate him into the family and the group, the so-called rite of passages. Here is an example of an attempt to use images to identify a ritual that in any society marks the beginning of a male's social and religious life. Circumcision. A group of stone sculpture and terracotta figurines depict a child not yet able to walk, generally seated or in a crouched position, with his right thigh slightly raised and his left on the ground while holding a small animal or other object with his right hand. Most of these sculptures come from the Syria-Palestinian area and the Cyprus. The Cypriot production is characterized by the variant of the child adorned with the pendants on various shapes, lifting his robe to reveal his sex. It was Cecilia Beer who suggested that this image reproduced the way in which young boys about to be circumcised were dressed and adorned with amulets to protect them from the danger of the operation they were about to undergo. The depiction of amulets around the necks of the temple boy also provides an opportunity to consider their use at a key moment in the women's life. One often wonders what the original purpose of amulet might have been, particularly of amulets related to the world of childhood, for example, Bess, Incissator, other than to be worn as necklaces or individual pendants. For example, where the so-called eye of Oro, one of the most common amulets of Egyptian origin, spread through the Near East Mediterranean, have been placed. One possible hypothesis is that they were hung on the cradle. This is suggested by the fact that the so-called Eye of Allah, a type of amulet widely used in the Near East, is found hanging from the cradle in a rural mud brick dwelling dating from the 18th century AD from Bekaa Valley. But it's just an example. We can find hundreds, if not thousands. And now we move from another problem, what the texts don't say and archaeology reveals. The hegemonic role of texts in the reconstruction of ancient history has undoubtedly had an impact on reconstruction of the role of women in rituals, especially those of the lower classes. Clay figurines play a central role in this regard, while ivory objects and seals, statuary are expression of elevated class of population. Clay figurines are fundamental sources of information for the less official aspect of religiosity, those in which the various components of the social hierarchy were involved both vertically, meaning in economic sense, rich and poor, master and slave, and horizontally, meaning men, women, and children. This is a more conservative type of handicraft production, less subject to fashion, perhaps because it was intended to preserve the family and the group memory in the domestic sphere, far from the pressure of the external influence. It is therefore no coincidence that clay figurines are often linked to the female world, in which one can often identify a strong element of cultural resistance, expressed through culinary, textile, and, of course, cultic practices. To speak of cult practices of women of Judea between the 8th and 7th century, we must rely on a famous group of figurines known as a Judean pillar figurine. They have been found mainly in private domestic contexts. Also, some specimens have come from tombs, while they are absent on very rare in the few cultic contexts known in the Judean area during this period. The great value attributed to these simple clay figurines lies in the fact that they testify to the fact that in the late 8th, 7th Judea, which according to biblical sources was already largely monotheistic, there exists a form of worship that have been defined from time to time as unofficial, within which the female divine figurine played a central role. I will not dwell on the complex question of the name to be given to this deity, Asherah, for whom it is reasonable to imagine a function of a protector of women in the domestic sphere. Women would presumably turn to this goddess for immediate and direct relief. Instead, I would like to dwell on the aspect of nudity. Nudity, without specific attribute, has been interpreted in different ways: an abstract concept, the principal quality of a human dignity expressed by Akkadian term bashtu, as a positive general message of pure pleasure, power, and fertility, as a specific deity defined as a mother goddess, also more specifically Nanna, Ishtar, or Astarte, and in a more concrete way, as a representation of the priestess, temple attendant, worshippers, and seductress. Leaving aside the critical debate on the use of the term mother goddess and the concept of fertility, and the need to find a divine name for these anonymous female images, some interesting recent studies have tried to focus attention on the connection between iconography and the supposed use and the social role of objects of this kind. Marta Luciani has argued that the mass-produced naked female figurines from the 3rd and 2nd millennium Mesopotamia represent real women and were used in connection with a social event involving a large section of the population. Candida Felli, speaking about the nude female figurines of ancient Mesopotamia, has hypothesized that this iconography, refer to a real figure playing a cultic role and having enough importance in daily life to justify its frequent representation. Whether they are divine or no, the expression of a concept or no, it is clear that these naked figurines are bearers of a social message transmitted to different audiences in different contexts. And now we arrive to the final phase of the life, the death, and the ritual of detachment from the deceased. Still, these images shows us the very important role of women in the ritual of detachment from the deceased, a ritual that can be situated between the personal and the collective sphere. In the Philistine area, the custom of Mycenaean origin of decorating the rim of the vessel used for funerary ritual with small figures of weeping women with both hands risen to the hair to pull out the hair is attested in the end of the 2nd millennium. A crater found inside a Telaitun burial in association with the Philistine pottery has on the rim figures of women in the round with long open robes showing their naked body, and a braid reaching down to their feet depicting in the act of mourning. Comparison point to the Mycenaean Decana with figures of lamenting women found in the necropolis of Attica, Rodi, and Cyprus and Crete. While the connection with the Aegean area is evident from the point of view of craftsmanship, the custom reserving for women the task of externalized grief over the death of the deceased is attested in various contexts in Mediterranean area, including in the 10th century Phoenicia, where images of mourners are depicted on the sarcophagus of Hiram. This is one of the rare depictions of funeral ceremonies in the ancient world, and particularly in Near East, and it vividly illustrates the strong expression of emotion associated with the mourning and marked by erotic overtones. We see women tearing off their robes to reveal their breasts and pulling out their hair. The work is well known to those involved in the Near Eastern history and archaeology, but the uniqueness of the subject depicted with the rarity of the depiction of the weeping women has made the scholar Ernesto De Martino, Ernesto De Martino is a very important Italian scholar, mentioned the sarcophagus in his famous study, Death and Ritual Weeping, a beautiful book that I hope will be translated into English sooner or later. Again, as in the case of childbirth, the interest lies in the rarity of depiction. on unfolding the funeral, which in the Levantine area, unlike in the production of Greek vases of the geometric period, tends to be alluded rather than explicitly shown. Another important element is the visual, auditory, olfactory experience of ritual, sound, music, dances, and chant. Ritual related to events such as birth, death, commemoration, and so on, whether in public or domestic places, had to be accompanied by sounds, colors, and chants. The use of textile and decoration are mostly lost, but the traces of color found on many artifacts originally placed in shrines give us an idea of how brightly dressed participants in ritual were present. The existence of music and dances that accompanied the rituals is again evidenced archaeologically by the few remains of instrument and engraving clay figurines from the early first millennium to Persian period. The female component of these activities is well attested by some documents from the Phoenician and Syrian areas. Images of procession of women dancing and playing music are found in the so-called Syro-Phoenician or Phoenician Cyprian metal cup, or like in this case, in a box from Syria, ivory box from Syria. The use of some instruments seems to be typical of women, as in the case of a tambourine, which is frequently reproduced, especially in clay. Finally, a rather unique function was played by perfumists. Their presence is suggested by the discovery of perfumes burning vessels found in both domestic and Celtic contexts. And now we move from images to archaeology, because while images provide direct evidence of some ritual action of women, in some cases it is possible to reconstruct the probable role of women in action witnessed by archaeological excavation. One such case is the excavation of Phoenician incineration necropolis of Tiro al-Bast, directed by Maria Eugenia Ubet, that I want to remember here. Thanks to a meticulous stratigraphic investigation above the urns containing the cremated remains, it was possible to identify the presence of pottery, mostly plates and in some cases jug, that was deliberately broken and scattered over the burial at the end of the burial ceremony. On the basis of the archaeological record alone, we cannot tell who cooked them. The food intended for the funeral meal, nor if it was not food who prepared the offering that were then thrown over the grave. However, through the use of analogy, we can imagine that since food preparation was a female prerogative in the domestic sphere, and since women had a definitive role in the ritual of parting from the deceased, they played a role both in the preparation of the food and in the act, probably, of breaking the dishing after the burial was over. Another example of the excavation of the possible interpretation of the role of women is the excavation of residential sector of the Jawa, Jordan, dating from the 8th to 7th century, where the collapsed remains of wrought roof of some dwelling were discovered. These layers have correctly been associated with various types of material, including male, female, and animal clay figurines, single-handled cups, goblet, tritons, oil lamp, miniature jar, exotic artifact, imported vessel, particular material. On the basis of these, it has been possible to think that the roof were used for cultic activity involving the use of images of deities or worshippers, the offering of food and drink, and the burning of aromatic plant substances, fragrant oil, and the perhaps incense. The use of roof for cultic activities, which is also well documented in the text, is further evidenced by the discovery of a small altar on the so-called type in the remains of the collapsed roof of an administrative building in Ashkelon, dated to the 7th century, destroyed by Nabucodonosor in the 604. Well, I will now hand this long paper in the hope that I have shed some light on some important issue, provided some food for thought, and aroused some interest in ancient women and the women rituals, which remain as a mystery today as they were in the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oggiano, for that fascinating talk. I especially appreciated your attention to the methods that you used and kind of the benefits and the downfalls of using them. I think starting there really helps our audience understand how you're able to talk about this subject more in depth. I want to take a quick second as we move into the Q&A portion of the lecture to remind our YouTube audience that this is a live lecture. So you can ask questions in the chat and they will be redirected to me so that I can ask our speaker. But I will go ahead and get us started. So when thinking about the Phoenician pregnant women, the figuring type that you mentioned with the hand on the belly, do you see these figurines as stand-ins for mortal women worshippers? Or do you see them as like more representing a divine pregnant goddess? You had a comparative example with some images of Mary, right? And she has this sort of in-between role of mortal and mother of God.
Yes, this is a big problem. How can we identify the role as are they gods? Are they human being? At the beginning, I start saying, no, but why they must be gods? No, they can be also human beings. But one element convinced me that these figurines can represent a deity. It is the throne, the presence of the throne, because the throne is in all the iconography used to be used by kings and gods, but not by common people. Therefore, recently, I'm moving to the interpretation of the figurines as God, maybe doing in couple with the Persian period figurine of the male with the bird, the long bird, Osiriac crown, or type Kidaris type crown.
Okay. Yeah. That's interesting that you mentioned the crown. I feel like that's a prime example of iconography being able to key you into something you might not otherwise know. So if I have a second to ask you another question, it was also really interesting that you suggested that childbirth was less often depicted in this figurine corpus, since it was something that elicited like a dangerous feeling, right? It was a dangerous time. While breastfeeding appears often in this like life-giving, less dangerous aspect. Do you think other amulets might have been used during childbirth, kind of in place of these anthropomorphic figurines?
I wanted to precise that it's a Cyprus in particular that give, but Cyprus is a crazy word with all the figurines, a representation of a very fantastic world, common people working in the household. But for example, in Phoenicia, we have not this kind of representation. Maybe I found, but I tried to find also in a comparative approach other word. And there are a lot, of course, in general, but is less represented. At the same conference, probably because is a strong representation. It's a very, and also the moment is a very delicate. I don't know. It's, what do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure. I think about maybe there's like, oh, Aaron, do you want to jump in?
Um, Sorry, just took a moment to unmute. Simply because I've addressed this issue kind of peripherally, but and from a Judean perspective, because that's the material I have to work with. But what I suggested is that very plain animal bone amulets that have the little inscribed eyes, that the color of that amulet, the sort of milky white, might be a suggestion, a sort of way of trying to convince the divine realm that that breast milk needed to continually be produced. There are modern parallels from traditional Spain and Morocco. Yes, but I don't have the knowledge to know if similar kinds of amulets exist in Phoenicia. I haven't looked at that question for Phoenicia. But that would be an instance where a sort of non-representative amulet might have had greater powers simply because of the color, the importance of the color. Right? And all.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. Kind of jumping off of that as well, I was curious, if you could think if there was a taboo sort of around depicting bodies in a certain context, if childbirth was a distressing time and it had the potential for uncertain outcomes, could there be a taboo around depicting that?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
I guess because childbirth could have been an uncertain time, right? You could have had outcomes that you didn't necessarily want in childbirth. It was a dangerous period. So do you think because of that, the society might have carried, they might have not wanted to depict childbirth so often, or there are certain ways they didn't want to depict childbirth, for fear of like making an uncertain outcome come true or something like that?
As I said, because it's a delicate moment. In some society, women are after the birth are isolated, for example, no, because the presence of blood, the presence are in a liminal moment between death and life. And as I said, the screaming, the blood, the tragic moment. And now we are used rightly to see this moment not only in this tragic perspective, also because fortunately things are changed, and it is not so dangerous as it was in the past. But anyways, is a difficult moment. It's not so beautiful and poetic, no? And on the other side, the feeding is a sweet moment, to see a mother with a child. And so I think this is the reason why the rarity and the frequency of the representation.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, we have time for one more question. So I'm curious, is there evidence that there might have been rituals surrounding the onset of puberty? Whether it's speculative or not, do you imagine that puberty as like a stage of life was possibly marked by a ritual in the Phoenician or the Punic sphere?
Probably, surely it was, but the problem is our archaeological documentation.
Right.
We don't have this kind of documents about. We have just the nudity or women offering the breast, or like some interpretation. For example, the figurine, like I said, Marta Luciani said that this mass production of figurine of nude, of naked women in Mesopotamia of the third and second millennium was produced probably in occasion of a wedding, or distribute, why not, in some rite of passage related to young girls, for example. We don't know.
Right.
Unfortunately, we have not texts speaking about it, but is an alternative interpretation, because we are used to say, nudity is connected to God. No, not necessary.
Okay, I see. Yeah, there's definitely so many avenues that we could go down. But I want to just take a second, because we're going to end, to say that this has been incredible. Thank you so much for your thoughts and your time. And also I want to say thank you to our YouTube audience for joining us today. I will now turn it back to my colleague, Becky Martin, who has a few announcements to conclude the series. Thank you again, Dr. Oggiano.
Thank you to you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oggiano, for your fascinating talk today. So this wraps up our Women and Gender in the Phoenician Homeland and Diaspora lecture series. But before we leave, I'd like to announce our upcoming lecture series for the 2024-2025 academic year, just titled Migration, Borderlands, and Social Boundaries and Antiquity. So keep an eye out for updates on our website and social media for more information on this upcoming series, which starts in September. Thank you all for joining us today.